Thanks for clicking on Preparing for the ACT 2021-2022. This is the science passage number 6. If you know the particular question you want to look at, go click in the description or on the slider and go right to it. So, some preliminaries. So what we've got for here for passage 6, we've got 3 studies that are comparing the effects of 5 sweeteners, and we've labeled them Q, R, S, T, and U. And what we've got in this table is, it says that they differ by their percent of mass of fructose and glucose. So all of these are actual percentages. They're not actual numbers. Now the key thing to note here, besides the fact that they are percentages, is as we go down the table, that is QRSTU, we have more fructose and less glucose. And this pattern is probably going to be important for these sweeteners. But that's one handy thing to note, is that as you go up the alphabet, you got more fructose in this sweetener and less glucose. So study 1 got groups of rats, and they have a 100 concentration of one of the 5 sweeteners. Each rat was in a separate cage. Unlimited access to the sweetener and to solid food for 56 days. So we've got the sweetener solution, that's a liquid, and to solid food. So those are 2 things they're eating. So since we're studying sugar, we're controlling the solution, but the food they eat, no, they don't say anything about that. So table 2 shows for each group the amount of sweetener and the amount of solid food consumed by the rat each day. So what we see is, as we go down the group, QRSTU, we see 2 patterns. We see less sweetener, and we see more food. That's the pattern that we see. So for study number 2, we got a 1 ml blood sample from each rat in a separate test tube containing this indicator, N. And so it reacts with leptin. So here this reacts with the leptin right there. And so the concentration was directly proportional to the leptin. Now directly proportional means if you double the leptin, you double the indicator. That's what that means. And so what we see here is that we see less leptin as we go up the alphabet. So that is more fructose. Now study number 3 says repeated, except that we use a different indicator. So it's got ghrelin, and then it forms a yellow dye, whereas in study 2 it formed a blue dye. Now that may be important, it may not be important. And so here, as we go up, we've got more ghrelin, and we have more fructose. Okay. So that's the information that they've given us. So let's see what questions were being asked. It says in study number 1, as the ratio of fructose to glucose increased. So that means as you increase fructose and drop the glucose, the amount of sweetener solution consumed by the rats, well, what happened? Well, that is right here. We can see that as we get more fructose, because that's what happens as we go down the letters, QRSTU, we are going to have less sweetener consumed. So that's why the answer is letter G. This is where we're looking. For 35, that question asks, in study number 1, the amount of sweetener consumed daily by each rat could be measured because which of the following steps had been taken? So this is not a measurement, this is a design question. And so in order to look at the design, you have to look at the instructions. And the instruction says each rat was placed in a separate cage. And so that's how were able to measure how much each rat has taken because they were not put in the same cage. They did not restrict their access to solid food. Now, actually, whoops, that is correct. Now, while letter B is correct, it doesn't indicate how you can measure. Because just because you have an all-you-can-eat buffet doesn't mean that you can measure how much someone eats. But if you give everyone their own individual buffet, then it's easy. That's how you know. 36. Suppose that a sweetener composed of a 46% fructose and 54% glucose was tested in study number 1. Now, that was actually never one of the 5. So we have to ask ourselves, all right, where would this show up? Well, that would show up, let's see, 46% fructose. That would be somewhere right here. 46 here, 54. So that's going to be somewhere between R and S. So given that, it says based on table 1, which we've looked at, and then study number 3. So we're looking between R and S. So that means it should be somewhere in between these two numbers, 1125 and 1279. So that's why the answer is letter H. 37. Here we have this claim. The group of rats that consumed the lowest amount of solid food per day was also that had the lowest concentration of leptin. All right, so we can look at this. Lowest amount of solid food per day. Let's investigate that. That we can look at from study number 1. Which rat group had the lowest amount? That would be group number 1. They had the Q sweetener. And now what are we saying? The lowest concentrations of leptin. Key word here. So which one dealt with leptin? Now they tell us. Study number 2. Study number 2 dealt with leptin. And so we're looking at group number 1 with sweetener Q. So did they have the lowest amounts of leptin? Well, no. They had the highest amounts. So we can get rid of letter A and letter B. Now letter C and D both say no, but now we have to justify it. So it says the rats in group 5 consumed the lowest amount per rat per day, but the rats in group 1 had the lowest amount of leptin per sample. This is what it's saying in answer D. So did group 5 consume the lowest amount of solid food? Well, no, that's not true. Group 5 consumed the most. So that's the problem with this one. The lowest amount of solid food per rat per day. That is not true. And so that's why we can eliminate letter D. All right. So question 38. So which of the following groups of rats should have been included to serve as a control? Now control, that's a science term that doesn't have much to do with what we're talking about here. A control is where you pretty much do nothing. That's a control group. Now look at what we're testing. It's comparing the effects of sweeteners on food consumption. So they were given different sweeteners and seeing how they consumed food. So what we want to do is we want to ask the question, well, what if we did nothing? What does that do to food consumption? So what they need is they need access to solid food. But we also know that they're going to need water. Whereas with these rats, they weren't given water, they were given the sweetener instead of water. So we give them access only to water and to solid food. So they can drink and they can eat, but the sweetener won't impact how they drink or how they eat. 39. Consider the sweetener that resulted in a solid food consumption of 16 grams per rat per day in study number 1. So let's find that. 16 grams of solid food, so we're talking about group 3, sweetener S. So based on table 1, how many grams of fructose would be present in 200 grams of this sweetener? So now we have to jump up to table 1, and we are looking at, it's saying how many grams of fructose. Now what do we know? This is 50% fructose. Well, 50% fructose of 200 grams. Now 50% is just another way of saying half. So we take 1/2 of 200 grams and we get 100 grams. So that's why the answer is letter B. And then number 40. The experimental design of studies 2 and 3 were identical with respect to which of the factors listed below, if either. So the key word here in this is, if you look at the directions for study 3, it says study 2 was repeated. And usually when we say repeat, that means do the same thing. Except that indicator P, which reacts with ghrelin, was used instead of indicator N. So the way it's wording is saying, was the experimental designs identical with either of these? So was the identical chemical indicator used? The answer was no. Different indicators. So since different indicators were used, we know that 1 is not included. They're not identical with respect to 1, so that means letter F is gone and letter H is gone. So what about number 2? Were they identical when it came to number 2? The hormone, which chemical indicators reacted with? Well, no. Study number 2 reacted with leptin. Study number 3 reacted with ghrelin. So they are not identical with that one either. Different indicators, different hormones tested. Thanks for watching. Please check out all the other videos on this test.